Here is Sailor Oregon, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is certainly a beautiful darker green, but just isn't a green that I want a bottle of. Now, there's no tone variation by nib, and it is consistently shading as an ink. Yet, again, it just doesn't speak to me to get a bottle. It is almost exactly the same on non-fountain pen friendly paper, as it seems their 50 state line largely does well on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Perhaps made for the paper many of us here in North America get. I've said it. It isn't for me. And I've said it's beautiful. So you decide.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is an Aurora Optima.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, this is actually the only tone variation we're ever going to get. It's slightly lighter here than it'll occur ever again. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread, there is some shading going on. Not hardly, but a decent amount. Look at hardly on the first line, where the har in the beginning is a little bit darker. It lightens during the R into the D, and the LY at the end does get darker. And it does this type of shading all the time, the back and forth between these darker and lighter tones. It's just that this tone of green isn't really for me. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, only by a little bit, really showing more of the darker tones, which is the reason that that's occurring. Now, there's no feather and there is no spread. There is some shading going on, not huge camouflage shading, but it's definitely there. On a majority of that first line, it's really one tone. When you see swung on the second line, the S is lighter, the U darkens the W darkens just a little bit into the 1, but the G at the end does get quite a bit darker. And Walls goes from a mid-tone W to a lighter A into darker LLS at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. It's very slight in what's going on. Look at wood on the first line, where the WO is a little bit lighter than the U, and it that gets a little bit darker with that U. The L, little bit lighter again, into the D, where it darkens up just a little bit. You have some shading going on, just not huge amounts of it. Look at have right next to that on the first line, where the H is very dark. The AV lighten up. It's that V into the E that gets pretty dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It barely shades at all, though there is some of it. You can see, like while on the second line, where the W is lighter than that H that darkens up a bit, the I gets a little bit lighter and the LE darker again. It's very subtle in its shifts back and forth, but it's there. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, but not with like a fury of it, but it is there. Look at breaking on the second line. That's under fury. Just got to misdirect people every now and then. Almost all of breaking is one tone. It's the G at the end that does get a little bit darker. It's as a tone a little bit darker than the word fury above it. Now, pieces underneath that is a little bit darker than breaking was in itself. So we're seeing some tone variation, but largely by word. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. So it's not huge in what's going on, but it definitely is there. Look at tail till on the second line, where the TAI is lighter than the L that's much darker at the end. Same thing happens with till. Lighter on the TIL, second L much darker, and this is about the shading that we're getting here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at thrushes on the first line, where the T is a nice mid-tone. The H gets quite dark. The U, words, the R gets quite a bit lighter. The U darkens up a little bit. The sh at the end gets to a nice mid-tone lighter than that U. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it barely shades at all on this paper. I forgot to mention it with the extra fine because the extra fine has been given some slight tone variations depending on the paper, but here what we get to see with it is that the tone of the paper is not affecting the tone of this ink, showing that this is a much more opaque ink and it's not getting affected by the tone of this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It barely shades. You can spot a couple of spots where it is a little bit darker, like the T of floated on the second line or the Y of heavy also on the second line. But it's really not shading well. We're just getting a very nice, generally solid green with this paper. Looking at the page underneath, you see that shame, it did bleed through touching the page underneath, but I don't think that's enough to stop my using it. Just that it happened. That happened with the stub nib, and we can see right where it happened, where it just did come through quite a bit more. Generally speaking, I want to say that the bleed is not really a problem, and the ghosting is not really a problem, though it did touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. No, it does shade a little less than it did with the Clairfontaine. It's not especially noticeable. Take a look at, let's say, mountains on the first line. The M is slightly darker than the OUN, and that T is slightly darker again, and then it lightens back up into the AIN at the end. Very little happening for shading. Now, it is standing out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, meaning this is generally a good ink to use on quad rule paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You can really see it with outburst on the second line, where the OU is lighter than the TBU. Now the R lightens up a little bit, and that ST at the end is very dark. Now the most noticeable thing is that darker tone that we're getting here really makes it stand out without any kind of a problem against this quad rule. Great combination here with this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did with the Clairfontaine, but you can see it. Take a look at outlet must on the first line, where the OU are lighter than the TL. The E lightens just a little bit, but that T gets darker again at the end. Now must starts lighter on the muss, but the T at the end, fairly dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 26. Here is Diatramentis Pine Green. Here is Diamine Evergreen. Here is KWZ Pine Green.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade a little bit. Meanwhile, on the third line, the ME is darker than the ANW, which lightened up that bit. The H got quite a bit darker. I lightened up a little bit. LE at the end, darker again. But we're with this quad rule. How is it doing to stand out against it? I think it's doing very well. It's not overbearing on it. It's not making it entirely disappear into the past. However, it stands out to where the quad rule isn't distracting to me to read it. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, I think, without a doubt, better than it did with the extra fine. Take a look at without on the second line, where the WI are lighter. It starts to darken up quite a bit into that T, even darker on the H. The OU lighten up a bit more. The T at the end does become darker, and it stands out against the quad rule without a problem. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade. Remember, on the second line is mostly a nice lighter tone for what this ink gives. The B gets quite a bit darker, and the ER at the end does lighten up again. It helps that this stands out very well against this quad rule. I think this is a great ink for on here. I think you should be very happy using it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Pen BBS number 138. Here is Noodler's Kung Ti Cheng. Here is Private Reserve Invincible Black. Here is Organic Studios Mabel's Scarlet.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It feathers a lot. It's very distracting. I don't know that we see spots that don't really have feathering. The spread's not out of control. This would not be a good combination in what's going on here. So even if it does shade, it in general looks woolly. It's got a kind of blurry look to its writing. That's not the recording, that's the writing. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it feathers worse than it did with the extra fine. So while I did have some nice things to say about how this does on non-fountain pen friendly paper, just not toilet paper, you know, that 20-pound copy paper from work, get something just a little bit better and you're gonna have a much happier time with this. This is not a happy ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade, it does look gross on the paper. The amount of feathering that's gone on with this ink in all three nibs on this paper is absolutely, for me, unacceptable to use it. I would avoid this paper with this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
A super consistent ink in tone and shading, as well as its performance on almost all papers from this pen. So what else is there to say other than that this is an obvious dealer's choice? So ink up your favorite pen and enjoy.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.